I would now like to introduce someone who has dedicated his life to investigating and telling important truths. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who worked as a foreign correspondent for almost 20 years, including as a New York Times foreign correspondent in the Middle East and in the Balkans. He has reported from more than 50 countries. In 2002, Mr. Hedges received the Amnesty International Global Award for Human Rights Journalism. Mr. Hedges is the author of 12 books, including the bestseller Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, a New York Times bestseller. He writes a bi-weekly column for ScheerPost and hosts the Emmy-nominated show On Contact. Mr. Hedges has taught at Columbia University, New York University, Princeton University, and the University of Toronto. He also currently teaches college credit courses in the New Jersey prison system. It is my pleasure to turn the floor over to Chris Hedges.
Thank you. The theologian Reinhold Niebuhr wrote that those with the courage to defy malevolent centers of power, what Immanuel Kant called radical evil, were possessed by a sublime madness in the soul. This sublime madness is vital. Without it, he wrote, truth is obscured. And Niebuhr also knew that traditional liberalism was a useless force in the face of radical evil. Liberalism, Niebuhr said, lacks the spirit of enthusiasm, not to say fanaticism, which is so necessary to move the world out of its beaten tracks. It is too intellectual and too little emotional to be an efficient force in history. Daphne, Howard, and the investigators, judges, and district attorneys who worked with the International Commission against impunity in Guatemala, most of whom are now blacklisted and smeared by the Guatemalan government, were empowered by this sublime madness. They were solitary, persecuted voices that demanded justice. They were our conscience, our moral guides, ironic points of light flashing out, as W.H. Auden wrote, wherever the just exchange their messages. Abraham Heschel noted that the voices of all prophets are a scream in the night. While the world is at ease and asleep, the prophet feels the blast from heaven. Defying evil cannot be rationally defended. It makes a leap into the moral, which is beyond rational thought. Those that defy evil know that they will not be rewarded, at least by the powerful and the institutions that serve them, for virtue. But corrupt rulers deeply fear those who are propelled by sublime madness, who cannot be bought off or intimidated, who are beholden to a moral commitment that transcends the practical. Those for whom self-promotion, even public opinion, are meaningless. Those who do not seek or need adulation. Daphne, Steve, and the human rights investigators in Guatemala who restored the word accountability to the ruling elites remind us that, as Augustine wrote, hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are and the courage to see that they do not remain the way they are. Radical evil for Immanuel Kant was the privileging of one's own interest over that of others, effectively reducing those around you to objects, to be manipulated and used to enhance your profit or your power. But Hannah Arendt, who also used the term radical evil, saw that it was worse than merely treating others as objects. Radical evil, she wrote, rendered vast numbers of people superfluous, human refuse. They possessed no value at all. They were, once they could not be utilized by the powerful, discarded. And so what do the powerful do to those they cannot control or silence? Those who shine a bright light into the inner workings of power, exposing the lies, the decadence, and corruption. The ruling elites are skilled in the dark arts of black propaganda. They use the courts to file libel suits and freeze bank accounts. They threaten and destroy careers, and they are not immune to murder. The ruling elites know most seeking the comfort and advancements that comes with conformity will do their bidding. A compliant media, wedded to the structures of power, is usually little more than an echo chamber for the elites, dehumanizing and transforming these lonely truth-tellers through character assassination and lies into hated pariahs. In Daphne's last interview, she said, and I quote, "I'm in a situation where people who can't even read English and therefore have never read anything I've written, at the same time are aware of who I am, know that they are meant to hate me or dislike me or despise me or disagree with me or whatever, and react to me on that basis, totally irrespective of what I write, but as the figure they are told to hate. So this has become a massive, massive problem. And I've had cases, especially when the incitement is really high at times of political tension, when I've had problems even with people in the street. And I look at them and think, okay, what's their problem with me? I don't think they've ever read anything I've written." The efforts to discredit and defame Daphne was done as well to the investigators in Guatemala. The former president, Jimmy Morales, when he shut down the commission, declared Ivan to be a threat to national security, as well as to Howard, who was outed at the Danske Estonian branch as the Danske Estonian branch whistleblower in 2018, when an anonymous source provided his name to an Estonian newspaper. The leak violated European, Danish, and Estonian law, and it had to have come from within the bank. But no European law enforcement agency investigated the leak, nor did anyone provide protection to Howard, whose life was now in jeopardy for exposing what looks like the largest money laundering scheme in banking history. And needless to say, he has been blacklisted by the banks and the financial sector. The aim of the leak was, of course, to try and pressure and intimidate me. As you can see, it hasn't worked, Howard said. Clearly, it was not a good time, including my wife's family back in Estonia. At least here in the UK, we were somewhat insulated. I bought a copy of the Financial Times with a photo of me on the front cover in my local village shop without attracting any comment. After that, there were various further articles in the Danish press to disparage me. Curiously, these stopped after the Danish prosecutor preliminarily charged top management and searched their homes. We can only speculate where those stories came from. Expose the mendacity, the corruption, the crimes of the ruling elites, and you pay. It is what they did to Socrates, what they did to Martin Luther King Jr., who, when he was assassinated in 1968, was one of the most hated men in America, at least among white Americans, and what they are doing to Julian Assange. It is a game as old as time. Flannery O'Connor recognized that the ethical life always entails confrontation. She wrote, St. Cyril of Jerusalem, in instructing catechumens, wrote, "The dragon sits by the side of the road, watching those who pass. Beware, lest he devour you. We go to the Father of souls, but it is necessary to pass by the dragon. No matter what form the dragon may take, it is of this mysterious passage past him or into his jaws that stories of any depth will always be concerned to tell. And this being the case, it requires considerable courage at any time, in any country, not to turn away from the storyteller. The central call of the ethical life, as defined by the Christian religion, is called bearing the cross. It is a call very few people achieve. Bearing the cross in Christian theology is counterintuitive. It says that the last shall be first and the first last. It demands nonviolence. It holds fast to justice in the face of withering attacks. It stands always with the abused and the oppressed, those the Jesuit priest Ignacio Ellacuría, who was murdered by the death squads in El Salvador, called the crucified people of history. It binds adherents to a higher moral law. Those who bear this cross, which upends and endangers their lives, are driven by sublime madness. For them, there is no other way to live. It is the central struggle of life, the struggle between good and evil. The meaning of the evolution of civilization is no longer obscure to us, Sigmund Freud wrote. It must present the struggle between eros and death, between the instinct of life and the instinct of destruction, as it works itself out in the human species. This struggle is what all life essentially consists of. We are tempted, indeed, in a consumer society encouraged, to reduce life to a simple search for happiness. Happiness, however, withers if there is no meaning. The other temptation is to disavow the search for happiness in order to be faithful to that which provides meaning. But to live only for meaning, indifferent to all happiness, makes us fanatic, self-righteous, and cold. It leaves us cut off from our own humanity and the humanity of others. We must hope for grace, for our lives to be sustained by moments of meaning and happiness, both equally worthy of human communion. And it is this grace, this love, which in our darkest moments allows us to endure. I witnessed many acts of physical courage as a war correspondent, but moral courage, the courage to speak truth and demand justice in the face of entrenched power, to defy those in your unit, to name and report war crimes and atrocities carried out by your comrades and ordered by your superiors, bringing with it vilification, threats, and sometimes death, was very, very rare. It requires, as all of those honored today experienced, the courage to accept becoming an outcast. It requires an inner strength and fortitude that even the toughest warriors usually lack. And this is why, as Hannah Arendt pointed out, the only morally reliable people are not those who say this is wrong or this should not be done, but those who say, I can't do this. I once asked the radical Catholic priest Daniel Berrigan, who was sent to federal prison for 18 months after he and his brother, Father Phil Berrigan, and 7 other religious activists in 1968 burned 378 draft cards of young men about to be sent to Vietnam, how he defined faith. Faith, he said, is the belief that the good draws to it the good, even if empirically all the evidence around us says otherwise. The Buddhists call this karma. But as Christians, he told me, we do not know where it goes, but we believe it goes somewhere. Dan, whose 50 books of poetry, essays, and scripture commentaries, as well as his play, The Trial of the Catonsville Nine, are as important a contribution as his activism, was the bête noire of senior church officials, including the Archbishop of New York, Cardinal Francis Spellman. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover fabricated a case against the Berrigan brothers for conspiring to blow up tunnels under federal buildings in Washington and kidnap Richard Nixon's national security advisor, Henry Kissinger. Dan, who took part in the freedom rides and civil rights marches in the South, was in and out of jail all his life. With 7 other activists, he illegally entered a General Electric nuclear missile plant in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania in 1980. They hammered and poured blood on the fragile cones of the Mark 12A warheads. He had been, by the time he died, a few days short of his 95th birthday, arrested hundreds of times. But what of the price of peace, he asked in his book, No Bars to Manhood. I think of the good, decent, peace-loving people I have known by the thousands, and I wonder, how many of them are so afflicted with the wasting disease of normalcy that even as they declare for peace, their hands reach out in an instinctive spasm in the direction of their comforts, their home, their security, their income, their future, their plans. That 5-year plan of studies, that 10-year plan of professional status, that 20-year plan of family growth and unity, that 50-year plan of decent life and honorable, natural demise. Of course, let us have peace, we cry, but at the same time, let us have normalcy. Let us lose nothing. Let our lives stand intact. Let us know neither prison nor ill repute, nor disruption of ties. And because we must encompass this and protect that, and because at all costs our hopes must march on schedule, and because it is unheard of that in the name of peace a sword should fall, disjoining that fine and cunning web that our lives have woven, because it is unheard of that good men should suffer injustice, or families be sundered, or good repute be lost. Because of this we cry peace, and cry peace, and there is no peace. There is no peace because there are no peacemakers. There are no makers of peace because the making of peace is at least as costly as the making of war, at least as exigent, at least as disruptive, at least as liable to bring disgrace and prison and death in its wake. The ethical life is not about the pursuit of happiness. It does not embrace the illusion of inevitable human progress. It is not about achieving wealth, celebrity, or power. It entails self-sacrifice. It is about our neighbor. The organs of state, security, in Dan's case, the FBI, monitor and harass you. They amass huge files on your activities. They disrupt your life. In Daphne's case, they took her life. We live in an age of radical evil. The architects of this evil are despoiling the earth and driving the human species toward extinction. They are stripping us of our most basic civil liberties and freedoms. They are orchestrating the growing social inequality, concentrating wealth and power in the hands of a cabal of global oligarchs through fraud and theft. They are destroying our democratic institutions. The goal is to render people superfluous, pushed to the margins of society where they and their children are no longer considered to have value. Value always determined by the amount of money produced and amassed. The French moral philosopher Albert Camus argued that we are separated from each other. Our lives, he wrote, are meaningless. We cannot influence fate. We will all die. Our individual being will be obliterated. And yet Camus wrote that one of the only coherent philosophical positions is revolt. It is a constant confrontation between human beings and their obscurity. It is not aspiration, for it is devoid of hope. The revolt is the certainty of a crushing fate, without the resignation that ought to accompany it. A living man or woman can be enslaved and reduced to the historic condition of an object, Camus warned. But if he or she dies in refusing to be enslaved, he or she reaffirms the existence of another kind of human nature, which refuses to be classified as an object. Camus is right about the absurdity of existence, right about finding worth in the act of rebellion rather than some bizarre dream of an afterlife or Sunday school fantasy that God rewards the just and the good. O my soul, the ancient Greek poet Pindar wrote, do not aspire to immortal life, but exhaust the limits of the possible. I differ with Camus only in that I believe that rebellion itself is not ultimately meaningless. It has the intrinsic power Dan called faith, to defy radical evil, even if radical evil appears triumphant. And we must note that the rulers of Guatemala have shut down the work of the International Commission against Impunity, that there have been no trials and no convictions for the 2017 assassination of Daphne, and that the massive financial fraud made public by Howard has yet to result in justice. But nevertheless, these efforts by these people allow them and us to be free and independent human beings. All those who expose truth chip away, however imperceptibly, at the edifice of the oppressor. They sustain by their actions the dim flames of hope and love. And in moments of profound human despair, these flames are never insignificant. They keep alive the capacity to be human. And we must become, as Camus said, so absolutely free that existence is an act of rebellion. All those who do not rebel in our age of totalitarian capitalism, who convince themselves that there is no alternative to collaboration, are complicit in their own enslavement. They commit spiritual and moral suicide. Václav Havel noted that these epic battles between good and evil are rarely planned. They are innate. It is not selflessness. It is the giving of one's best self, giving one's highest self unto the world. It is finding true selfhood. Selflessness is martyrdom, dying for a cause. Selfhood is living for a cause. It is choosing to create good in the world, choosing to treat others as we would want to be treated, choosing to hold up the universal self that unites us all. And these acts are the irreducible essence of life itself. You do not become a dissident just because you decide one day to take up this most unusual career, Havel said. You are thrown into it by your personal sense of responsibility, combined with a complex set of external circumstances. You are cast out of the existing structures and placed in a position of conflict with them. It begins as an attempt to do your work well and ends with being branded an enemy of society. The dissident does not operate in the realm of genuine power at all. He or she is not seeking power. He or she has no desire for office and does not gather votes. He or she does not attempt to charm the public. He or she offers nothing and promises nothing. He or she can offer, if anything, only their own skin, and they offer it solely because they have no other way of affirming the truth they stand for. Their actions simply articulate their dignity as a citizen, regardless of the cost. I stood with hundreds of thousands of rebellious Czechoslovakians in 1989 on a cold winter night in Prague's Wenceslas Square as the singer Marta Kubashova approached the balcony of the Melantrich building. Kubashova had been banished from the airwaves in 1968 after the Soviet invasion for her anthem of defiance, Prayer for Marta. Her entire catalog, including more than 200 singles, had been confiscated and destroyed by the state. She had disappeared from public view. Her voice that night suddenly flooded the square. Pressing around me were throngs of students, most of whom had not been born when she vanished. They began to sing the words of the anthem. There were tears running down their faces. It was then that I understood the power of rebellion, the power of truth. It was then that I knew that no act of rebellion, however futile it appears in the moment, is wasted. And it was then that I knew that the communist regime was finished. The people will once again decide their own fate, the crowd sang in unison with Kubashova. I had reported on the fall of East Germany before I arrived in Prague. I would leave Czechoslovakia to cover the bloody overthrow of the Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu. The collapse of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe was a lesson about the long, hard road of defiance that makes profound social change possible. The rebellion in Prague, as in East Germany, was not led by the mandarins and the political class, but by marginalized artists, writers, journalists, clerics, activists, and intellectuals such as Havel, whom we met most nights during the upheavals in Prague in the Magic Lantern Theater. These Czech activists, no matter how bleak things appeared, had kept alive the possibility of justice and freedom, just as Daphne, Steve, and the investigators in Guatemala have kept alive the possibility of justice and freedom in our own time. Their stances and protests, which took place over 40 years of communist rule, turned them into figures of ridicule, or saw the state seek to erase them from national consciousness. They were dismissed by the pundits who control the airwaves as cranks, agents of foreign powers, fascists, or misguided and irrelevant dreamers. I spent a day after the Velvet Revolution, during the Velvet Revolution, with several elderly former professors who had been expelled from the Romance language department at Charles University for denouncing the 1968 Soviet invasion. Their careers, like the careers of thousands of professors, teachers, artists, social workers, government employees, and journalists in our own universities during the communist witch hunts, were destroyed. After the Soviet invasion, the professors had been shipped to a remote part of Bohemia, where they were forced to work on a road construction crew. They shoveled tar and graded roadbeds. And as they worked, they dedicated each day to one of the languages in which they were all fluent: Latin, Greek, Italian, French, Spanish, or German. They argued and fought over the interpretations of Homer, Virgil, Dante, Goethe, Proust, and Cervantes. They remained intellectually and morally alive. Kubashova, who had been one of the most popular recording stars in the country, was by then reduced to working in a factory that assembled toys. The playwright Havel was in and out of jail. The long, long road of sacrifice, tears, and suffering that led to the collapse of these despotic regimes stretched back decades. Those who made change possible did not try to reform the Communist Party. They did not attempt to work within the system. They did not even know what, if anything, their protests would accomplish. But through it all, they held fast to moral imperatives. They did so because these values were right and just. They expected no reward for their virtue. Indeed, they got none. They were marginalized and persecuted. And yet these poets, playwrights, actors, singers, writers, journalists finally triumphed over state and military power. They drew the good to the good. They triumphed because however cowed and broken the masses around them appeared, their message of truth and defiance did not go unheard. It did not go unseen. The steady drumbeat of what Havel called living in truth exposed the dead hand of authority and the rot and corruption of the state. The walls of Prague were covered that chilly winter with posters depicting Jan Palach. Palach, a university student, set himself on fire in Wenceslas Square on January 16th, 1969, in the middle of the day, to protest the crushing of the country's democracy movement. He died of his burns 3 days later. The state swiftly attempted to erase this act from national memory. There was no mention of it in the state media. A funeral march by university students was broken up by the police. Palach's grave, which became a shrine, saw the communist authorities exhume his body, cremate his remains, and ship them to his mother, with the provision that his ashes could not be placed in a cemetery. But it did not work. His defiance remained a rallying cry. His sacrifice spurred the students in the winter of 1989 to act. And Prague's Red Army Square, shortly after I left for Bucharest, was renamed Jan Palach Square. 10,000 people went to the dedication. We, like those who opposed the long night of communism, have few mechanisms within the formal structures of power that will protect or advance our rights. We too have undergone a coup d'etat, carried out not by the stone-faced leaders of a monolithic communist party, but global corporate power. We too have our designated pariahs and huge black holes of state-sponsored historical amnesia. We may feel in the face of the ruthless corporate destruction of our nation, our culture, and our ecosystem, powerless and weak, but we are not. We have a power that terrifies the ruling elites, and all those we honor today are evidence of this power. Any act of rebellion, no matter how few people show up, or how heavily it is censored, chips away at the edifice of power. All acts of rebellion keep alive the embers for larger movements to follow. It passes on another narrative. It will, as the rot of the state consumes itself, attract wider and wider numbers. Perhaps this will not happen in our lifetime. But if we persist, we will keep this possibility alive. If we do not, it will die. I want to close with a personal story. This is the first time I have spoken in public about it. I want to tell this story especially for Daphne's husband and 3 sons. I am a writer like Daphne. I have always written. I wrote incessantly as a boy, just as I write incessantly now, a strange inner compulsion. When I was a boy, I wondered how my writing could make the world a better place, especially because I admired my father, a Presbyterian minister who was in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. I did not want to write for myself. I wanted to write for others. When I was 19 years old, Donald Bowles, an investigative journalist for the Arizona Republic, who, like Daphne, uncovered influence peddling, bribery, and fraud among the ruling political class, got into his car. It was June 2nd, 1976. He drove a few feet. Suddenly, a remote-controlled bomb, consisting of 6 sticks of dynamite taped to the underside of the car beneath the driver's seat, detonated. The explosion shattered his lower body, opened the driver's door, and left him mortally wounded while half outside the vehicle. Both legs and one arm were amputated over a 10-day period. On the 11th day, he died. I felt the blood rush to my head as I read the story. I had never heard of Don Bowles. He had been followed, his phone had been tapped, he had been denounced. His personal records, including his bank records, were illegally taken and scrutinized to frame him. I got a pair of scissors. I cut out Bowles' picture. I taped it to the wall. I knew, in that instant, what I would do with my writing and with my life. There is a young woman or a young man somewhere who, until Daphne was murdered, may not have heard of her. They did not only hear her story. They felt the seismic impact of her life. They saw in her courage, her relentless pursuit of truth, her sublime madness, what it meant to truly be a writer, what it means to have a life of meaning. They have her picture. It is seared into their mind. I do not doubt this. I was that young person once. I felt that blast from heaven. The good draws to it the good. And this good is unconquerable. It is part of the eternal battle against evil, and it has the power to transform the world. My faith has been tempered in hell, the Russian war correspondent and novelist Vasily Grossman wrote. My faith has emerged from the flames of the crematoria, from the concrete of the gas chamber. I have seen that it is not humankind, that is impotent in the struggle against evil, but the power of evil that is impotent in the struggle against humankind. The powerlessness of kindness, of senseless kindness, is the secret of its immortality. It can never be conquered. The more stupid, the more senseless, the more helpless it may seem, the vaster it is. Evil is impotent before it. The prophets, religious leaders, reformers, social and political leaders are impotent before it. This dumb, blind love is humankind's meaning. Human history is not the battle of good struggling to overcome evil. It is a battle fought by a great evil, struggling to crush a small kernel of human kindness. But if what is human in human beings has not been destroyed even now, then evil will never conquer.
Journalists here were expected to sort of cover up for powerful people, to partake in the culture of silence, and my mother refused to do that. This really put her in a sort of ultra-minority.
For decades, she was the #1 voice that encapsulated the success of a woman going against everything.
She had hundreds of thousands of readers. She just blew the newspapers out of the water.
When political parties are threatened by a journalist, they will isolate them, they will dehumanize them. In the case of Daphne, they will demonize them.
They have made me into what in effect is a national scapegoat. And this has gone on for 30 years.
Political parties here perversely own television stations. Therefore, most people get their information from political parties.
People have no idea of how she was targeted so viciously.
I got used to it, like a scarf almost around the room. But my biggest concern is that because people see what happened to me, they don't want to do it.
She had so many sources and so much information was coming to her. She couldn't handle it on her own.
She was the source of so much information that was about to bring the reputation of our country down in tatters.
When the Panama Papers broke, most journalists in Malta took it at face value. These politicians have offshore companies, it's unethical, that's it, case closed.
You had people in a position of power who were trying to set up dodgy structures in order to funnel money away from jurisdictions that would have otherwise traced them. What Daphne did is she exposed them.
She didn't stop working on that investigation, even after the subject had changed.
In denouncing this, Daphne was perceived as a threat to the easy money that many people were benefiting from.
Nothing was normal around that time. We were in this kind of emergency situation already. All these sort of forces were working together against my mom. I was working full-time on the Paradise Papers investigation, and we had sort of settled down for the day at this big table that we shared as a desk. My mother had to go to the bank. She left the house, and then I heard the explosion. Ever since then, everything changed completely.
Within the first hour of her death, they had started putting up an incredible fight to defend her work.
Suddenly, we had to transform ourselves into a kind of advocacy organization. Before that, we were just people trying to, live our lives.
Today I am reminded that no matter what happened to Daphne, no matter how hard certain forces will work to suppress or distort her work, even in death, she lives on. Daphne lives on in my 3 sons, who have so much of her strength and integrity. She lives on in the people who choose to protect her legacy.
The immediate reaction we had was, we've got to make sure this doesn't fade away. This is why it's been so important to us, even on a personal level, that, civil society movement emerged, because imagine doing all that on our own.
Change, societal, cultural, political, far-reaching and meaningful change requires a critical mass of people who are prepared to actively participate in the shaping of their own future, that of their children and this country. Simply agreeing is not enough. We must do. Because if not us, then who?
This was more than a year after the Panama Papers. All that evidence of corruption had been published and nothing happened. And this investigation into money laundering and corruption ultimately led to her murder.
Whoever wanted to kill Daphne didn't only want to achieve her death. They also wanted to achieve the end of her investigations. They also wanted to secure their own impunity.
It's only by force that there is going to be any investigative work done.
Justice for Daphne is not just about jailing her murderers. It's about justice for her stories, which is that all the people she exposed, they have to face justice too.
It is very important that they stay exposed, because Daphne, unfortunately, was very well known in Malta, but she only became a big star of the anti-corruption movement internationally when it was too late for her.
People in power, at best, stood by while she was killed. At worst, helped in getting her killed.
There are many powerful, violent, dangerous, corrupt people who are fighting back against us. If there's more impunity, our lives are going to continue to be in danger. So for me, it's really a question of life and death, as it was for my mother.
It's such a beautiful country. It is a crime. There is so much corruption. It's really everywhere.
Indonesia has one of the last remaining tropical forests. If you talk about Indonesia as the producer of oxygen of the world, everyone actually is the victim. We need that tropical forest to be protected. We need that tropical forest not to be the source of corruption. Corruption is everywhere. corruption has been likened to a disease that is really eating the whole country and suffocating us. It hampers the country's ability to serve its people.
The corruption is so chronic here in Indonesia that the public services that should be the rights of the civilians, of the people, are not being given. All the people in below economic class, they don't have the money to pay the bribe or the embezzlement and doesn't have proper public services. All the public officials, most of them are pretty corrupt.
For example, the family of the mayor, they have more than 40 luxurious cars. They go abroad, they buy in high-class boutique, but within 20 kilometers, there are people who cannot eat.
So I think there is an acknowledgement from the government that we have a problem. You actually have young people, and most of them are young people, ready to put their life in danger, fighting against corruption.
Where are you, Mr. President?
It has become very personal to me to fight corruption because I'm just sick of these people getting whatever they want just because they have the authority.
So that is why it's very risky. They have money, they have political networking, and they have power to intervene. We should use the law as our tool to fight with the authoritarian regime.
For me, I just want to obey this constitution. I don't care who you are. That's very important for this country.
So ICW is the most important organization working on this issue head-on.
In ICW, all of us is young people below 40. They are lawyers, teachers, mathematicians, biologists. We have a different background, but we have the same dream about how to use our skills to combat corruption.
But more importantly, they also work on a minute, real, practical level. They look at papers, they look at numbers, they look at budget, they look at planning, they look at implementation.
We investigate the case, we find the facts, we use scientific methods, and then we do press conference about that. So we really trying a different strategy. We are campaigning, we are watchdog, but we also have recommendations that can be implemented.
One day Indonesia will no corruption.
Indonesia needs ICW.
This is not about yourself or your own country. This is about the whole world. We have to work hand in hand.
For the sake of the people, I want it to be a better place for all of us.
Indonesia Corruption Watch.
Danske Bank provided a hole in the wall around the Western financial system that allowed vast quantities of illicit funds to flow in without anyone knowing who they belonged to.
I found that this company, which had been a big active customer in the bank for several months, had filed accounts saying that during that same period it was dormant, and yet they shoved $200 million in 4 months through their accounts. It could just have been one company, one bad lot had got in. But once I started digging, it was obvious it was something much more systemic with the customer base.
Anyone who provides a back door through this is able to make a lot of money out of it. That was the business model of Danske Bank's Estonian branch.
I looked at the 3 largest UK LLPs, the 3 most profitable ones in Estonia, and I pulled the accounts, and it was quite interesting. They were all fake.
Not just that, they all basically looked the same, and it turned out that they all had the same registered office in the UK. Firstly, it looked like this particular group of companies had been into some very bad stuff. But worse than that, it looked like there'd been some collusion as well. I made my whistleblowing report directly to Copenhagen, and the reason being was that the issues seemed to be so serious that it wasn't appropriate to raise them within the branch. Not appropriate. The internal auditors confirmed what I found, but then they just did nothing.
The fact that the bank then essentially refused to take the action that they should have been taking only added to the seriousness of what he was exposing.
There's a lot of people who valued their career more than doing the right thing. You know, I don't want to be involved or anywhere near this, so I resigned. I also warned them that I'd taken legal advice and that if they weren't going to go and inform the authorities, then I was quite prepared to do it myself. When I resigned, the bank had a right to enforce a non-compete clause to stop me going and working for a competitor and paying for it. Guy flew over from Copenhagen, met in a hotel, presented me with this agreement. The problem with this agreement was that there was also essentially a very tough gag clause, non-disclosure agreement within this. I wasn't happy with that, basically because of the lack of action from management over the previous months.
The non-disclosure agreements, they're used all the time to silence whistleblowers.
This senior executive looked me in the eye and he gave me his personal assurance that he had zero tolerance for money laundering and he was going to sort the whole thing out. His personal assurance. So reluctantly I signed.
The lead whistleblower is being told he can't identify the people involved, the customers, and he can't identify the corporate officials who are involved.
The bank is an economically rational actor. Even if the bank is 90% sure that if it went to court it would lose, it would still be rational for the bank to sue me because it would set an example to other potential whistleblowers. We can't demonize regimes and have our own little side industry of people who are making money off their money. It doesn't wash.
He is a man of principles, you know? And I think that that drove his decision-making throughout the entire process, even though you could tell that some of the decisions were extremely difficult for him to bear.
Some Estonian newspaper decided that one of the great questions that needed to be answered about the Danske Bank story was who was the name of the whistleblower, and that was me.
The criminal gets protection of the identity. The whistleblower's identity is leaked and there's nothing he can do about it.
We weren't really pleased to have my name come out. It's not great from a safety point of view.
Whoever outed him, wanted to make sure that he felt intimidated.
The people he exposed have very long memories. I have no doubt that certainly they will think he still knows secrets that could be harmful to them. And the fact that he did what he did is something that they have a track record of not forgiving.
He was told right from the beginning that the Russian secret police were one of the people controlling an account. And one of Putin's relatives had an account.
And so, yeah, he will always be in danger. He has given himself a life sentence. Even though we can't be sure about the dimensions of this problem and we can't be sure how much money we're talking about, we are more sure or less unsure than we were because of Howard Wilkinson's exposure of Danske Bank's crimes.
When you get a whistleblower like Wilkinson, who exposes something so big, there will be accountability. There will be reforms.
I think what he did was principled and correct, but also incredibly brave. And it deserves, greater recognition than it's received.
One hopes never to run into anything like this, But once you've run into it, you hope that when you report it really to a proper level, that people will do something appropriate about it. You know, it's 6 years on now.
We've all heard of corruption, abusing entrusted power for private gain or benefit. It can be anywhere: a judge paid to deliver a favorable verdict, companies colluding to drive up prices, leaders abusing their authority to increase their power, status, and wealth. It exists in countless forms, but one aspect always remains the same. Once corruption takes root, it grows, and grows, and grows. Although one corrupt act may seem insignificant on its own, together these acts can crush a society. Corruption diverts resources from those who deserve them, those who can't live without them, and into the pockets of the powerful. Mansions get built, while schools and hospitals fall into disrepair. Natural resources are unjustly acquired, exploited, and ruined. Corruption is not a victimless crime. Corruption costs money, and in some cases, it costs lives. It puts a barrier between people and their human rights. The first step in stopping it is exposing it. But when courageous people reveal corruption, the truth can be fatal to their careers and relationships. That is where you come in. Stand up and speak out for anti-corruption laws and whistleblower rights, because when we stand in solidarity, the truth will win out. Together, we can stop corruption and help those in our communities fully realize their human rights. The Allard Prize celebrates anti-corruption heroes. Nominate yours today.